The light was fading, spilling its last gold over the broken boards and leaning facades of the town. Wind swept the street, dragging thin veils of dust that clung to the air and stung the eyes. Somewhere far off, a door banged shut, and the hollow clap echoed down the near-empty row of buildings. She came from the shadow of the old mercantile, stepping as though her legs were made of wire that had been bent too many times. One hand clutched the torn hem of her dress, the other hung useless at her side. Her breath rasped, catching in her throat, and when she opened her mouth, the word came thin and cracked, a splinter of sound barely carried on the wind. Help! The syllable slipped into the street like something fragile. No one came forward. A man leaning in the doorway of the saloon glanced at her, then spat into the dirt. Curtains twitched in an upstairs window, only to fall shut again. Boots scuffed on wood somewhere behind her, then faded away, swallowed by swinging doors and lamplight. She stood swaying, the dust curling around her skirts like some slow-moving tide, her shadow stretching long and thin toward the east. Under the brim of his hat, Eli Harper tightened the worn leather cinch on his mare, testing the strap with a practiced tug. He heard the word and let his hand still, though his gaze didn't rise immediately. The street was long, and the distance between them was filled with silence that felt older than the buildings themselves. When he did look, it was brief, a glance that took in the crooked set of her bonnet, the way her shoulders hunched against nothing but the evening air, the bruise blooming under the hollow of one cheek. She didn't look his way. She looked at the dirt, at her feet, at nothing. Her shawl clung to her narrow frame, the fabric so thin it caught the fading light like paper. She adjusted it once, fingers trembling, but it slid back into place with no more warmth than before. He saw how her knees softened, how her weight shifted as though she were deciding whether to stand or fold. Eli bent his head and worked the saddle horn strap loose from its hook, looping it the way he always did. The habit was older than the scars on his hands, and just as deep. He stepped into the stirrup, swung up, and settled into the seat, the leather groaning under him. The mare sidestepped once, sensing something in him. Hesitation, maybe, but he nudged her forward. They started down the street, his eyes ahead on the gap between buildings, where the prairie opened wide and empty. Halfway to the end of town, he turned his head. She was trying to walk now, pushing away from the porch post, with more stubbornness than strength. 2 steps, and she caught herself on a hitching rail, fingers curling right around the wood. Her shawl slipped, catching on a splinter, but she didn't notice. She stayed there, head bowed, the wind worrying at her skirt. No one helped. The far-off thump of a hammer from the livery, a door creak, a laugh spilling from behind the batwings. These were the only answers to her whispered plea. Eli slowed the mare without thinking, the reins loose in his hand. He watched her knees give, just a fraction, as though her body had decided before her mind. She clung to the post again, but the next gust pried her fingers loose. He swore softly under his breath and pulled the mare around, boots pressing into her sides. The sound of hooves came quick now, closing the space between them in a handful of heartbeats. She didn't look up until the shadow of the horse fell over her. By then, he was off the saddle, boots in the dust, one hand on her arm before she could topple forward. Her weight was nothing, bones and cloth, and the faint heat of someone burning the last of their strength. She smelled faintly of travel, dust, sweat, and something like wood smoke clinging to the fabric of her dress. She didn't fight him, didn't try to explain. She only sagged against him, her bonnet tipping to hide most of her face. The street had gone quiet in that way it does when eyes are watching from behind walls. Eli felt them, the gaze of the town pressing at his back, but he didn't lift his head. His coat brushed her cheek, and then her hand, small, cold, found the collar, twisting in the worn leather like it was the only thing that could hold her here. Her voice was weaker now, the edges fraying. "Don't leave me." The words were not a command. They were not even a request. They were something smaller, spoken from a place she might not reach again. He adjusted his hold, one arm behind her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted her as if she weighed less than the saddle he'd left swinging on the mare's back. The dust rose around them with each step he took, swallowing the tracks they left behind. Somewhere in the distance, A coyote called from beyond the edge of town. He didn't stop walking. Dust trailed behind him as he carried her, the mare following at a slow, patient pace. The street seemed narrower now, lined with faces half hidden in shadow. Some watched with quiet curiosity, others with the kind of tight-lipped judgment that didn't need words. A drunk slouched against a water trough muttered something, low and cutting. "Fool's trouble, Harper." Eli didn't break stride. His boots met the ground with the same steady rhythm, each step pushing them closer to the edge of town where the buildings thinned and the sky took over. Beyond the last post fence, the land opened wide and barren, nothing but dry creek beds and brittle grass under a sky so big it could swallow a man whole. He shifted her weight slightly, feeling how she seemed to drift in and out, her head resting against a shoulder in the saddle. The mare's hoofbeats echoed against the emptiness, a lonely sound that seemed to follow them no matter how far they rode. The air cooled as they moved farther from town. The sun was sliding toward the horizon, throwing long shadows across the land. Eli's mind wandered to the barn fire last winter, the smell of smoke thick in his throat, the sight of cattle huddled and coughing in the snow. He thought of the drought that summer, how the creek beds cracked wide open, how each week the banker's letters came folded in neat, tight envelopes. And he thought of the quiet since his brother had died in the war, how no one had crossed his threshold for more than a few minutes in years. The cabin came into view just as dusk settled. It was a plain, squat shape against the rolling land, walls weathered silver by wind and time. He dismounted, lifted her down without ceremony, and carried her inside. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing out the prairie wind. The room smelled of wood smoke, dust, and the faint lingering tang of leather. A rough-hewn table sat near the hearth, a single bed against the far wall, a narrow shelf lined with tin cups and chipped plates. He set her down on the bed, the blanket scratching under her weight, and moved to the fireplace. The kindling caught after a moment, the flames pushing back the shadows. He poured water from the bucket into a tin cup and held it to her lips. She drank as though she'd been walking for days, swallowing fast, eyes half closed. When she finished, he took the cup back and set it on the table. She didn't bother with the blanket or remove her bonnet. Her eyes closed and her breathing deepened. Eli sat in the chair by the window, elbows on his knees, staring at her in the flickering firelight. She was a stranger, and strangers in these parts brought trouble more often than they brought thanks. He could feel the quiet weight of her presence in the room, heavy with whatever past she carried. For the first time in years, he didn't know what he'd find waiting for him in the morning. The light that woke him was pale and cold. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, bonnet on the table, fingers laced together in her lap. Her hair was dark, tangled from sleep, and her eyes flicked up when she realized he was awake. "Clara," she said, so soft he almost missed it. The name hung in the air, fragile. He nodded once, not asking for more. She avoided his gaze, her shoulders curling inward. Through the morning, he watched the way she moved, quiet steps, careful hands, always aware of where he was in the room. She flinched at the slam of the shutter when the wind picked up, and when she reached for a pot, he noticed the hardened skin along her palms, calluses from years of labor. But her boots were finer than the rest of her, city-made, though scuffed and worn now. By midday, she stood by the door, shawl pulled tight, looking toward the horizon. "I should go," she murmured. He didn't lift his eyes from the leather strap he was mending. "East is 40 miles to the next town. West is desert till you can't walk anymore." Her hand tightened on the shawl, and after a moment, she stepped away from the door. The days that followed brought whispers back from town. Eli heard them in the stiff way the store clerk looked at him when he asked for extra flour, the slow way the sack was pushed across the counter. "That for you?" the man asked, eyes narrowing toward the wagon outside. "Or for someone else?" Eli didn't answer. He loaded the supplies and left without looking back. One morning, while Eli worked the fence line, a rider appeared at the edge of the pasture. The man's coat was fine, his posture stiff, his face clean-shaven but cold. He reined in just close enough for his voice to carry. "You keeping someone here that don't belong?" Eli kept his eyes on the post he was mending, hand steady. "Don't recall saying you could." The man's voice was smooth, with the kind of edge that comes from knowing money will always speak louder than law. Eli didn't answer. He drove the last nail into the post with a sharp crack. When he finally looked up, the man was already turning his horse. Dust trailed after him as he rode off toward the horizon. When Eli came back to the cabin, Clara was at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, though there was nothing in it. Her knuckles were white, and the tremor in her fingers was impossible to miss. That night, the wind came hard from the north, rattling the shutters and hissing through the cracks in the walls. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing red light across the floorboards. Clara sat close to it, eyes locked on the flames. Her face was calm in a way that didn't match the rest of her, like she'd made peace with something she shouldn't have. "You should have left me there," she said, her voice low, the words almost lost in the wind's howl. Eli didn't look up from where he sat sharpening his knife. No. The sound of steel against stone filled the silence that followed, steady and unbroken. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls as if testing their strength, but inside, neither of them moved. The frost was still clinging to the edges of the trough when Eli rode into town with the calf tied in the wagon bed. He sold it quick, no bargaining, just enough coin in his pocket to keep the pantry from going bare. He was halfway to the blacksmith's to pick up a sharpened plow blade when he noticed them. 3 men, their horses hitched outside the saloon, steam curling from the animals' muzzles in the cold. One of them wore that same fine coat, dark as wet earth and pressed sharp at the seams. Eli kept walking, head low, but the sound of their voices floated down the street, confident, easy in the way of men who'd never had to earn their place. He stepped into the blacksmith's and found the man bent over an anvil, hammering a curl into a length of iron. "They were asking after you," the blacksmith said without looking up. "Or not you exactly. Said they're looking for property gone missing. Figured you might know something." Eli didn't answer, only waited for the plow blade. He carried it under his arm all the way to the wagon, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the street without turning his head. The men were still outside the saloon, but their gaze followed him until he disappeared past the last building. That night, Clara's hands trembled when she set the pot of beans on the table. He watched her in the lamplight, saw the way her eyes kept flicking to the window, as though she expected shadows to move there. "They came again," he said quietly. Her mouth pressed thin. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't need to. After a moment, she sat down opposite him, fingers curling into her lap. She spoke without looking up, the words flat, but waited. She'd been in their house, one of the big ranch spreads where the fences ran farther than the eye could see. Worked the kitchen first, then the laundry. No pay worth naming, just a cot, and the food they scraped from the serving platters. When she got too slow, they put her in the stables. She learned quick not to speak unless spoken to, and even then, only what they wanted to hear. "They didn't own me," she said, "but they thought they did." She'd walked away one night, nothing but the clothes on her back and a stolen crust of bread in her pocket. The rest she left behind. Eli listened, his face unreadable, though something deep in him shifted. The law wouldn't stand on her side. Men with that kind of money could claim her, drag her back, and no one would say a word. Later, after she'd gone to bed, he sat at the table with the small ledger open before him. The fire was down to embers, the wind hissing faintly through the chinks in the wall. In that ledger were his grazing rights, the few notes he kept about debts and the seasons. He turned a page, dipped the pen, and let the ink pool at the tip. When she came out, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, he didn't look up right away. His voice was even when he spoke. "You'll take my name." She stopped in the middle of the room, eyes narrowing slightly, as though she hadn't heard right. He lifted his gaze. "We go into town tomorrow. Make it legal." She stood there, the lamplight catching in her hair. "Why?" He set the pen down, folded his hands over the open book. "Because they can't take what's mine." The next morning, the frost lay heavy on the ground, crunching under their boots as they walked. They didn't speak. Their breath hung in the air like smoke, and the wind tugged at Clara's shawl. She kept her eyes forward, each step measured. The courthouse leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeling in long strips that fluttered when the wind caught them. Inside, the justice of the peace sat behind a desk piled with papers, spectacles low on his nose. He didn't ask questions, just slid the forms across the desk and tapped the ink bottle. Eli signed his name slow, each letter drawn deliberate, the weight of it pressing into the paper. Clara took the pen in both hands. Her grip was tight, her hand unsteady, but she signed beneath his name all the same. It was done in minutes. No bells, no blessings. They stepped back into the cold, the sky wide and pale overhead. By the time they reached the Mercantile a week later, the whispers had already made their rounds. The clerk handed over the coffee tin without meeting Eli's eyes. "Mrs. Harper," he muttered, the words sour in his mouth. Clara didn't respond, only tucked the tin under her arm and walked out ahead of him. But there was something in her expression, faint, almost hidden, that looked like the first breath taken after being underwater too long. The fine-coated man didn't return. Whatever claim he thought he had was gone, at least on paper. The gossip in town grew, twisting into something half curious, half scandalized, but Eli didn't care enough to listen. One evening, after the chores were done and the fire was going strong, Clara stood in the doorway with her hand resting on the rough wood. Her fingertips traced the carved initials there, E.H., cut years ago when the cabin was new. She went over them twice, slow, feeling the depth of each letter. Then she crouched slightly, took a small nail from her pocket, and scratched a single C beside them. It was faint, almost invisible in the low light, but she looked at it as though it was the only thing that mattered. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke about. The wind grew sharper, cutting through the bare branches, and frost spread its lace across the fence rails each morning. Eli rose before the sun, his boots crunching over frozen dirt as he worked the land with quiet determination. Clara kept the hearth warm, mended the worn shirts that hung by the door, and sometimes, without realizing, let a faint hum escape her lips as she stirred the pot or folded the linens. When they crossed paths inside, it was with a nod or the briefest word. Out on the porch, when he came in from the cold, she'd meet him with a bowl or a mug, fingers brushing his as they traded the weight. At first, those touches were fleeting, by accident almost, but they stayed a moment longer as the weeks passed. One morning, the sky still dim, Clara made her way to the far fence line where Eli was hammering a post into place. The air was sharp enough to bite the lungs, and her breath came in soft clouds. She carried a tin mug, steam curling above it, and stopped just inside the gate. He looked up from his work as she crossed the frost-stiff grass, her shawl drawn close. She held out the coffee without a word. His glove brushed hers when he took it, but neither pulled away immediately. That pause hung between them, a quiet acknowledgment neither had the need to name. The first snow came slow, drifting down from a sky the color of pewter. By the time the ground held a thin white coat, Eli was in the shed, carving a plank with steady hands. The letters took shape under his knife, each cut deliberate, the sound of blade on wood crisp in the stillness. When he finished, he wiped the surface clean, the curls of shavings falling away to reveal the words, Harper Ranch. Beneath, two initials, E and C, set close together. That afternoon, he stepped outside with the plank under his arm. Clara was sweeping the porch, her breath misting in the cold. He didn't explain, didn't ask. She stepped aside as he found the right spot above the door. The hammer rang once, twice, 3 times, until the sign was fixed firm against the weather. She tilted her head to read it, her eyes lingering on the smaller letters. No one spoke, but when she passed under it to go inside, her back was straighter, her steps more certain. The wind rose after dark, rattling the shutters and hissing under the eaves. Inside, the fire cast a warm glow, shadows swaying across the walls. Eli sat at the table, his chair angled toward the hearth. Clara set down a plate before him, then took her place opposite. They ate without hurry, the sound of cutlery soft against the plates, the silence between them easy now. In the corner, the door stood closed against the cold, the new sign above it catching the flicker of the firelight. Outside, the winter night pressed hard against the cabin walls, but inside, the warmth held. The wind howled, the flames whispered, and the two of them stayed at the table long after the plates had gone empty.